Hello and welcome to Season 4, Episode 19 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop.
I'm Mark Bishop.
And we are, of course, reading Alan Ryan's On Politics, a book discussing the history of political thought from Herodotus to the modern day. And this time we are discussing Hegel as the modern state, as the work of spirit. An interesting chapter, very long chapter. I think it was like 45 pages. I think the chapters just keep getting longer in this book and more detailed, because I think we started out, Herodotus was like 20-something pages, and now we're like double that, but I don't mind. I like to read these, and I think they're interesting.
Yes.
All right, good thoughts from you tonight. Should we just jump right into it? Anything you want to air right now?
You're just inviting me?
I mean,
you're not even trying.
I feel like if I do it at a certain point, it'll keep you from doing it later while I'm talking.
I don't think that's true.
No, it's not.
I think that you're... I feel like I've let you down by not going on a rant when you invite me to go on a rant, and so then I have to find the opportunity later. So let's just move on.
All right, let's just jump right in. To Hegel's Germany is how this chapter starts out. Alan Ryan states that Germany as a single political entity didn't exist when Hegel was born. During the first two-thirds of the 19th century, German unification was achieved by Prussia's force of arms, conquering non-Austrian German-speaking states and making them one Reich. Of course, at this time, there were a lot of different tiny countries that spoke German sort of as the language. So Prussia acquired essentially all of them except for Austria. So you had Austria and Prussia as the two big German-speaking countries by the 19th century, essentially. But Hegel was born in 1770 in Stuttgart and died in Berlin in 1831. His father was a civil servant, and Hegel had a much interrupted career. He entered the Tübinger Theological Seminary at 18, and later became a professor at the University of Jena in 1805. In October of 1806, the Prussian army was defeated by Napoleon at the Battle of Jena, and Hegel became enraptured with him as the spirit of the world. And then kind of inspired by this, he published his masterpiece, The Phenomenology of Spirit, which we'll get into a little bit later. In 1808, he became rector of a gymnasium in Nuremberg, and then was appointed to a chair of philosophy at Heidelberg in 1816, and then the chair of philosophy at the University of Berlin in 1818. In this position as the chair of philosophy at Berlin was very politically visible, and Hegel lectured on the modern state as in a very conservative Prussia, but we'll talk about later, he was kind of a mix of both conservative and liberal. So a very interesting character with a lot going on during his lifetime.
Happenings historically in his neck of the woods, so to speak, but he seemed to get through them very well. Ended up being essentially the professor of philosophy at the most preeminent university for that purpose at that time in the area he was in. So he seemed to have gotten along a lot better than some of the other people we read about.
Yes, he was not beheaded. He was not imprisoned, as far as I know, or banished.
Or condemned to silence.
So obviously he was not a very good philosopher.
Well, he wasn't controversial enough.
That is true. He needed to be more controversial. But speaking of that, we'll get into his reputation here. I'm going to read just a short section from the book on page 654. He says, Hegel's reputation has waxed and waned even more dramatically than that of most political thinkers. To those intoxicated by his system, he has seemed to illuminate the universe in ways unparalleled by any other thinker. Those who have thought it all hot air have dismissed him in Schopenhauer's memorably abusive phrase as a nauseating, illiterate, hypocritical, slope-headed scribbler. Some admirers of his metaphysics have thought his political philosophy vastly inferior. J.N. Finley described it as breathing the stuffy atmosphere of the waiting room of a minor Prussian official. Others have thought his metaphysics unintelligible, but admired his insights into social and political life. So kind of all over the place in terms of who thinks what is important about Hegel, but of course we are focusing on the political part. But Alan Ryan does say his metaphysics matters to his political theory because his theory is embedded in a vision of humanity's moral and cultural history. Says understanding this connection does not require us to believe the underlying philosophy. This is just kind of, seeing where he's coming from.
Right.
He wrote only one philosophical work on politics itself, which is The Philosophy of Right, which was published in 1821, which was concerned with the administration of public affairs and the maintenance of a framework in which subjects can pursue their individual interests. But behind all of his accounts of the state lie his phenomenology of spirit and the philosophy of history. So those are two other works we're going to be looking at. He says, this chapter proceeds with a written account of the purpose of Hegel's philosophy, his elements of his social and political thinking, his account of self-consciousness and freedom from the phenomenology, and his ideas of human freedom in the philosophy of history, and then the account of the constitutional state in the philosophy of right. So that is what we will be talking about for probably like another hour. That tends to be how long these episodes go.
Right.
but
well,
interesting.
maybe I'll cut down on my ranting and maybe cut back about 15 minutes.
Maybe.
Yeah, and the author points out that the time where he was living, with the French Revolution and all that upheaval, it makes a good point where he's emphasizes that the French Revolution made everyone aware at that time the irreversibility of historical change. Once that historical change, a change of historic proportions, you can't go back.
Yeah.
And I don't think the modern American realizes that or appreciates it, I guess I should say, on how much things could change, and you won't go back to what it was before. People are screaming for, we got to change this, got to change that, the Constitution. But once you do that, it's done, and you can do something different in the future, but you'll never go back to what it was when you have a historical change.
True.
Like the French Revolution. People that lived in those times, recognize that. We've had a blessing of stability for a few generations now, and I think people are just getting complacent. That's my
good
deep
thoughts.
thoughts.
Good thoughts.
Thank you.
We're moving into his ideas on philosophy and how it is not political activism. He says Hegel wasn't active in politics, but was a philosopher. He says philosophy comes on the scene too late to tell the world how it ought to be. He says it's retrospective and can only understand a form of life when it has grown old. He says the philosopher's task is to uncover the meaning of what we do and reveal how our desires and beliefs make up our own identities. Therefore, it doesn't compete with political science, but really competes with religion. And religion does the same thing as philosophy, but pictorially rather than rationally. He says, philosophy is looking at the world, trying to understand it rationally, while religion is looking at it pictorially. He believed that the ultimate reality was the mind. And this is kind of what he equates with God throughout his writings. God and the mind are sort of the same thing. He says the mind comes to understand itself only by manifesting itself in the creative world and working through culture, religion, art, politics, etc. He says there's no God or mind separate from its own creation. So it's kind of this idea God sees himself through his own creation, in that the world is somewhat like the biography of God. He says human beings are at home in the world as it is our world. The world is intelligible to humans, and the cultural and intellectual history of mankind is the biography of God, which is an interesting way of looking at things. I think this is different than a lot of thinkers that we've looked at before. I don't know. What are your thoughts on this? The mind is the ultimate reality and sort of looking at itself through creation.
Well, I think it sounds very similar to people that believe that tripping on acid brings you closer to reality because it gets you past the physical limitations and into the spirit world, if you will, or the real world of mind and being, and that we're all part of the same organism kind of thing. And
I think Joseph Campbell would really like this.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. That's true. Also, Joseph Rogan, I think is
the two great Joes, equal in intellectual capabilities.
You say that jokingly. I got a lot of. We
talked about this last episode.
Last episode, you're very critical of Joe Rogan, and I think he's an underappreciated social scientist and political commentator, philosopher, and thinker. I mean, the guy has. I don't want to get on a sidetrack, but he has a tremendous memory for recall of specific facts, and he is interviewing like 3 people or at least a week for like 3 hours at a time. And some of them are really deep. Some are just silly. But he benefits from that because I think he's gotten a lot better over the years. He's certainly a lot more informed. I mean, because he's obviously engaged with these people. Could you imagine having that opportunity that he has to talk at length about any subject you want with some of the greatest thinkers and important people of our time? I mean, that's his day job. Yeah. Isn't that amazing?
That is crazy. Well, if we keep this up for another 10 years, maybe we'll get there.
Well, when he started out, he was just like he had like a spare bedroom that he made into a studio. It was just him and Jamie, whatever he did for a living. It was just the two of them. And they were just, hey, I wanted to start talking to people. It was the beginning of internet podcasting. It was before you called it podcasting. I don't know what you called it back then. Streaming, I guess? Or it'd be like it was just an online interview forum. There's no sponsors. There's nothing. It was just, he was just talking to people that interested him. And he's just like, that person seems interesting. They want to talk to me. And it'd be like people that were I'm exaggerating because I wasn't paying attention then, but people that said the Holocaust wasn't real, you'd be like, yeah, sure, come on. Some crazy shaman that was ripping people. Yeah, what do you have to say? And just because he was just like he'd talk to anybody. Yeah. But anyway,
yes.
But yeah, this whole, the reality, the God is just a mind, or there's some sort of essence to everything, where it's all part of it, and of course, I don't buy into all that stuff.
Yes.
I mean, I'd buy into it to a point, I guess, because we're all God's creation, and he God is our reality, but I don't buy into this this consciousness thing, that we are just part of something else, some other consciousness, which I think is implied in a lot of this.
Yes, I think so too. I agree.
Good
Thoughts. Moving on to the phenomenology of spirit. That's a fun word to say.
Well, it reminds me of that song.
God. Yes. Yes, that's great. But he starts off the phenomenology of spirit. You do not need to do that every time. He says the mind is not passive, but essentially free. And so that's one of his big things is freedom. He says freedom is the origin of knowledge and the source of value. He says we transform the world in thought to make it intelligible. He says all human activity shows that we are free, and all else is the raw material of our freedom. The mind confronts the material world as something other, and so the material world is not one's own until it is mastered and understood. So he says, to make things our own, we have to really understand them. Otherwise, it's just this other thing that is not us. He says, other human beings pose a problem to this. He says, the other human beings are part of the physical world, but also see the world as we do. So our instinctive response is to think that if the world is our own, it could not be another person's. And so that's where he kind of draws, there's a lot of conflict that comes from that. How do we deal with this?
Right.
He says the ultimate resolution is that we acknowledge all people as equally free and entitled to use the world in equal terms. But he says this lies still far away in human history. We have not gotten to that point where that's guaranteed in all the laws and everything. He says, we all want others to acknowledge us as master of the world, and so he who is least afraid of death becomes master, and all others become slaves to that master. I read here from the book. He says, however, there is a worm in the apple, and the worm carries the future of human culture. The master cannot have what he wants from slavery. He seeks recognition, but a slave's recognition is tainted. Being extorted, it is no recognition at all. One might as well recite one's virtues to a recording device and play it back. Sartre made much of this insight in his novels, and Groucho Marx wrote a comic commentary on the thought when he said that he wouldn't join any club that was willing to have him. The slave's acknowledgement of the master's superiority isn't worth having just because it is a slave's recognition. So that's kind of what he says is the origin of slavery. We want all people to recognize us as the true owner of everything, as the true mind, essentially. And so that is why we subjugate other people.
Yeah, I think he's overthinking it.
I think so too.
I think we just kind of want to have stuff. And we don't want them to have it. And if we can enforce our will and make them do the stuff we don't want to do, they're our slave.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's really a concept above that. Another, when you question the morality of it and the philosophy of it, I guess you can define it any way you want. But I don't think it's because we're challenged by the concept of that person being another sentient being that has an equal claim to the world. Because unless it's subconsciously, because generally slavers, people who are the master in this master-slave relationship, generally will be trying to dehumanize the slave and not think of them as an equal.
Yeah, because that's what he kind of says too. He says, there's a problem. People who own slaves did not, interact with the slaves directly, especially, when he's talking about, a slavery in America, especially. It's like, well, they were hanging out with other people of the same status. So what does the recognition of the slave have anything to do with it?
Right.
So.
Yeah, he seems to. The book goes to great pains to talk about this theory, and it just seems like he argues against himself, like Hegel does.
Yeah,
and I don't know I don't know why he got the author got bogged down in the summary of Hegel's political thought when he's by talking about the master slave and the philosophy of mind and consciousness. I mean, it's interesting from a philosophical or history of philosophy point of view, but it seemed to get into a lot more detail of his underlying philosophy than was necessary in a book about political
Well, we
philosophy.
covered Hegel in our first season.
Correct.
I don't remember too much of what we talked about. I think we only talked about really the phenomenology of spirit and sort of the world spirit idea. But oh my God. But yes, I agree with you there. But there's more to it, and that is the idea of Stoic freedom. He says, the slave owns the future. The slave is disciplined.
I like the Stoics. Do you like the Stoics?
I like the Stoics.
You did like the
Stoics. I really like the Stoics. The Stoics were good.
Who was it that you didn't like?
The skeptics.
Skeptics.
I like the Stoics, not the skeptics.
Yes.
Skeptics suck. Stoics succeed.
Rule.
I was using S words.
Oh.
Says, yeah, just trying to make it alliterate. But he says, the slave owns the future. The slave is disciplined. To put the matter less vertiginously, one might say that if we are to acquire self-mastery and become rational, autonomous creatures, we must learn how to conduct ourselves prudently and intelligently, how to shape means to ends and see ourselves living in the world, turning it to our purposes and not resenting the constraints it places upon us. It is the slave who can, in principle, understand what human freedom is. He says, the master essentially is putting a limit on himself. His passion for the control of another is the real loss of freedom. He says, this is the insight of Stoicism. The slave can be his own master. The slave who can choose calmly between obedience and punishment ensures the choice remains his, and so remains autonomous and free. The master who cannot control his own reactions is unfree. However, Hegel doesn't see this as an entirely satisfying theory of freedom, as it is a choice between two evils, but agrees that the essence of freedom is that we obey only ourselves. And so he's using this idea of freedom. He's always searching for the conditions of autonomy in thought, action, ethics, and politics. This is really one of the underlying ideas, is again this idea of freedom and how we can be free and obey only ourselves.
Yeah, and I think that's an important distinction to make, but it's also important to not equate the two, because the person who's enslaved you is limiting your options.
Yes.
So, and you get to smaller and smaller available options.
Yes.
To choose from until you have no choice. Because if you're a slave and you're just tied up in a dungeon, what choices do you have left?
Yes, I can choose to either be happy about my imprisonment, or I can choose to be sad about my imprisonment.
I guess that's true. Yeah, I can choose to try to stay awake or fall asleep voluntarily. I guess. I mean, your choices are so limited. You are so obviously not free.
I like the insight of Stoicism in that it's this idea that others cannot control how I perceive the world, or make me essentially like react to them. My reaction is always my choice. I might not have a choice in what they do to me or what exactly my options are in the moment, but I can always choose how I respond to those things. I don't think that's necessarily complete freedom. If I'm imprisoned in a dungeon, I do not have complete freedom. Right. But if I'm responding to it in a rational way, I think that's a better insight of Stoicism, and that's the approach that you should take.
Agreed.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, there's still an element of free will and choice, and in a way, it's like even if you're a prisoner, you still can assert your individual choices or your free will or your humanity.
Yes, exactly.
Right, and so you see a lot of different like prison movies, especially that play on to how does somebody retain their individuality and their spirit or their soul in those kind of soul crushing conditions. Everything from Bridge Over the River Kwai to Shawshank Redemption.
Well, it's a good tie into a book I've been reading. I've talked to you about The First Circle, which is, of course, by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, everybody's favorite book by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who's a Soviet author.
You act like people don't know this book.
People know this book?
Oh, yes.
No, I don't know this book. No. But apparently it's a well-known book.
Especially in like the former communist, neo-conservative, or neoliberal in the bigger sense, but the people that understand what tyranny is, and the anti-communists, because the bucket of people that have either became anti-communists or are anti-communists, they understand his work is very influential.
Because Alexander Solzhenitsyn, I think was imprisoned in a gulag at one point, and so he's writing about what is essentially the first circle of hell. Using Dante's terms, but it's the prisons in the Soviet Union that were for like the intellectual types. So they were like the cushy prisons where they were forced to work and create theories and new equipment for the Soviet Union. I believe it's set during like the 50s, early 60s at this point. So it's like what they're doing there and stuff. And I was thinking there was going to be more of a plot by this point. I've hit like page 300, which is like halfway through the book. Yes. And it keeps just giving like, the like dioramas of characters. So I think it's just jumping from character to character with some bit of an overarching story, but it's really like showing how each person is individual still and what the struggles they're facing in this prison and stuff like that.
I've never read, and I've tried to read Dostoevsky, and boy, it's hard.
Russian novels are long, they're dense. Yeah,
and I'm kind of a lazy reader, especially of fiction. Fiction. Because I want the author to get to the point. I want to get the action going. Yeah. And if it takes me too long to develop the characters, I kind of start losing interest.
Yeah. I'm not that way. I really like Tolkien, so that's a lot of description and not
that is true
compared to the amount of like actual action there is. But
but he was but he would get bogged down. That's true. And,
but I like that type of stuff.
Right.
So
and then I remember reading David McCullough's biography of John Adams, and a lot of it was he had a lot of correspondence to his wife, and then later to Thomas Jefferson. And there's a lot of detail. It's like he's writing another letter. Okay, why don't you just tell me what happened? Okay, maybe summarize 5 of them or something. But it was a good book. Good story too.
Yes. Yeah. That all came from Stoic freedom. But moving back to Hegel and the philosophy of history. So it's a very brief summary of the phenomenology of spirit and where freedom plays into. Yeah, that's great. But now on to the philosophy of history.
Yes.
He said it was avowedly a theodicy in that its object was to justify the ways of God to man, so very much concerned with God. He says world history is not the story of all. He says there are very few lives that interest philosophical history, and fewer peoples are world historical peoples. So he says the entire continent of Africa is unhistorical because nothing that has happened in Africa is relevant to world history. But
that's a pretty bold statement.
That is pretty bold, yes, very bold. He discounts everything. But he says the future course of the history of freedom might lie with the U.S. and Russia. So somewhat of a prophetic, statement there. Especially this was 1800s, early 19th century.
Before Marxism, before communism, before the United States was really a superpower.
Yeah.
We didn't really.
Yeah, this is pre-Civil War United States.
Right.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. And I don't agree with what he's saying about Africa. I think African history is probably not very relevant to European history.
Yes.
I mean, it is, especially with what they call them, the wars coming in through Spain and all that. I mean, they're terribly influential, and depending on how you define the Byzantine Empire, and then all the intellectuals that were in Egypt. I mean, to discount all that, now when you get to Central and Southern Africa, there's less of an argument about their influence on Western thought, but to say that they had no historical importance whatsoever from a philosophical point of view, I think from his point of view, he's never read anything from them, and maybe he has a point. I don't know. I haven't studied the great philosophers of sub-Saharan Africa, but I do appreciate his point. It's a harsh statement to make that most people essentially lived and died in obscurity.
Yeah.
And their lives are not of historical importance, but I think there's a lot of truth to that, except for that they kind of carry on the human race and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And so we all have a role to play, so to speak, in the development of human society. But 500 years from now, is anybody going to know Mark Bishop? No. I mean, when you really come down to it, and so I think it's a harsh statement to make about it's a part of a theory of the great man theory of history, where only certain great people actually make a big difference.
Yeah. Well, I kind of see that all the time with I'll be scrolling through Instagram, and I get recommended like a lot of history stuff and stuff like that. It'll be like, here's an interesting fact about, this African king at one point in time. Like, oh, that's kind of interesting. But all of the comments, every single comment will be, why didn't they teach us this in school? This is so important, blah, 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 blah. They're ignoring all of this black history. And I just think to myself, well, it's, in a high school class, you have, one semester with this teacher who just wants to teach you what is important for you and for your life, and really just for your country, of course, because we're Americans. We're usually learning about American history and American involvement in world history.
Correct.
And it's like, well, where would they fit in this bit about this interesting African king, admittedly? But it's like, what importance does that have to what we need to learn here? And I think that's what, needs to be considered more. It's not just that we're ignoring it. It's just, where does this play into the story of us?
Well, when it comes down to it, for American history or world history, a lot of that is just a curiosity.
Yeah.
So like when I was in, maybe I might have been high school, maybe I was in 8th grade, we had a history of the Roman Catholic Church. And I thought it was really interesting, that there's there's the arc of history, the big things, the events, the popes and all that stuff. But there's always thousands and thousands of what I call asides. Like in the particular book, I remember the textbook, there would be like little, what do you call those, little like columns, be like on one page, it would just be like a short little column about somebody who lived in that time.
Yeah.
It would be a saint or whoever it would be, or a political leader. It'll just be a little summary, a little blurb of their life, and maybe they did something really interesting or very courageous or terrible or whatever. And you could just fill up your mind with all that stuff. So, yeah, you're saying, you have to curate it so that it's stuff that impacts the subject, not just because it's interesting or because they were great people, or because they're terrible people, or whatever. But yeah, it's so I tend to agree with Hegel to a point, depending on what your subject is, but just to discount an entire continent of
I don't think it's irrelevant.
Irrelevant to Western political thought, perhaps.
Yeah,
because there was no communication or no influence on Western political thought, but you're already limiting it to just Western political.
It's important to limit your scope, and you're looking at what is important, not every single detail about everything.
Now, I would agree if he was making the claim about the illiterate nomads of North America. Because they had no role to play in political thought, period.
It's a bold statement.
Well, did they?
I mean, they had mythology and such, but I wouldn't say it entered into, Western political thought.
Was it worth anything?
I mean, I think yes.
Their mythology was worth something.
I think yes. I think any stories...
To them, other than to them.
Well,
obviously,
no,
it was important to them.
I do think it is important. I think it is important to preserve those kind of things. I think they have worth just as a product of human creation.
Well, yeah, like a painting.
Yes.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Yes, it's beautiful and it's important.
It's a good story.
And it reflects their views and that sort of thing. I think it's important to preserve those kind of things. I'm not saying we should just...
I'm not saying
you seem to be arguing in favor of it's not important. It needs to be gone.
No, I'm not saying it needs to be gone. It's just, it's a curiosity. It's very interesting.
I mean...
You know what else is interesting? The Simpsons TV show. Is that that could be historically? It was influential. They predicted a lot of world events, evidently. But
I would say the Simpsons is probably more relevant on American culture now than Native American mythology. But I will still say that I think Native American mythology is
I put it in the same category, though.
I would.
Well, actually, I would put it in a better category. It's art and it's history and it's interesting. I don't consider it valuable as far as philosophy. It's not a philosophical development. Sure. It didn't bring us closer to the truth or understanding of the world.
I mean,
except for those people that believe that taking peyote leads you to a better understanding of the world.
I mean, I think it brings us to a better understanding of how humans create stories and evolve that sort of thing over time. Because that's what we were talking about all last season is, how some stories are universal, or not last season and season 2.
Right.
So some stories are universal and carry similar themes and how that's important to recognize and, similar across humans.
Well, if we, there are some peoples that vanished from the world.
Yes.
And so the question is, if those people, like, that, and I don't mean like vanished, like died, but they had a culture, like there were some South American tribes or whole swaths of people that probably because of smallpox or other diseases that were brought by the early explorers, when later explorers came back 100 years later, there's nothing there. There was there's descriptions of entire cities, like in the Amazon. There was one person that went kind of deep into South America, talked about cities with tens of thousands of people, and they thought he was crazy. Because when people came back 100 years later, there was nothing there. It was just jungle. Well, if you now with they can do surveys by essentially sonogram, they can find, see there's temples there underneath the jungle. So the guy was right, but they got wiped out presumably by some sort of infection that these explorers gave to the people, and they wiped, like smallpox or whatever the case may be. And so an entire people was wiped out.
Interesting.
And so, our discussion would beg the question, well, if that culture just kind of died of a natural cause, it's like it wiped out by a meteor, would our understanding of truth, of universal stories between cultures or anything be really significantly impaired?
I don't think it would be impaired, but I think it would be benefited by having that.
How can it not be impaired if it benefits us by knowing it?
Well, because
let's say if we never knew.
Well, you're looking at it kind of like backwards, right? Because if you're saying, well, our understanding of truth, blah 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 blah, well, that's assuming that we already don't have that anyway. Because our understanding of truth would not be impacted by something that is not part of our understanding of truth.
Correct. So how did those, because the cultures existed and we are aware of them, they've been studied and documented. Yes. How has that impacted our understanding of philosophy, truth, religion, morality.
Well, it gives us more data to look at.
Yeah, but what does that data do except for just additional data? If I count 2 + 2 = 4 a million times, I have a lot more data.
Sure.
But I've established 2 + 2 = 4 the first calculation.
Sure. I don't know the point you're trying to make here. I think it is fundamentally important, fundamentally good to preserve as many aspects of different human cultures as possible.
I agree.
So then what point are you making?
I withdraw the statements. I'm making a really controversial statement and an insulting statement to entire cultures, plural, of people, by essentially saying that their religion and their philosophy contributed. It's like, what was that? It was a scene from a movie where somebody gave a really stupid answer, and the moderator of the debate says, "You are completely wrong. Nothing you said was accurate, and we are all now less intelligent for having been here and listened to it." I'm paraphrasing, and that's kind of the essence of what I'm saying. That there's really no positive influence. There's no great advance in human history due to their activities.
I see what you mean.
I'm trying to. I know there are some, but I can't think of any now. Not in philosophy.
Okay.
Not in any sort of philosophical understanding. And I know people would disagree with me. The ones that I would say fetishize, Native American culture. Oh, they're so great. No, it's the earth is a spirit, and we're all part of nature and all that kind of stuff. Well, I don't think thought of before.
I don't think you need to have. I don't think you need to have that worldview to say that it's good to have, just more stuff preserved.
You're arguing past me. I'm not arguing that point.
Okay.
I'm not saying burn it all to the ground.
Well, sure. But you're saying it would not be a shame if it was.
No, I'm not saying that.
But you're saying it's not important.
I'm saying that it had no influence on human understanding.
Okay.
That's what I'm saying. Whether it existed or didn't exist.
I mean, I say, but I'm looking at it like, the comparative mythology we talked about last time.
Yes.
Because, there's still so many gaps in that of how we understand, how humans create these stories and how they evolved, where they came from. I'm saying without those, we'd be missing so much of comparative mythology and stuff like that.
I understand your point.
All right.
We should move on.
We should move on. We'll get stuck in this forever.
Yeah, I hope there's no Native Americans that are listening to this, because they're right now they're going, they're on the warpath.
Back to Hegel. We're talking about the philosophy of history and how world history is the important peoples. He says the development of the concept of freedom begins with the idea that one person is free, then that some people are free, then that all are free. He says, however, this is not necessarily a linear path throughout history. He says Hegel often admired the freedom of the ancient Greeks. We kind of go back and forth between these phases in different places and different cultures. He says the human will is the source of freedom, and under despotism, only one person is free, as all people are under the despot are subjects of his will, not their own. He also says there are no politics in such an environment. So that's even going back to Plato when we talked about, there's no politics in the Persian Empire.
Right.
He says the idea that some are free came in the Greek polis, and this was because of the limits of citizenship and the presence of slavery. So you did have some people being free citizens and contributing to politics, but not everybody. He also says that Athens had achieved something the modern world could only envy, and that was the aesthetic unity of everyday life and harmony between the individual and society. So those people that were free were 100% involved in politics and were very much, connected to the city and to society in a way that we don't have today.
Yeah, I have to suspect that there was a lot more dissension than we're aware of.
Yeah.
I mean, just by human nature, there would have to have been people grumbling about it. I don't know if anywhere in human history there wasn't, and there was a lot of really contentious disputes among the assembly, in Athens and different Greek city-states as they went forward, So and there was such a limited number of people. Well, it's kind of when you limit the number of the population that have freedom, they're going to be a lot more homogeneous and a lot more agreeable to each other because they're so much smaller. You know, if you have 10 people out of 330 million making all the decisions, they're going to feel pretty free. And so I don't know. I think they're overstating the level of freedom and the level of unanimity, and they really praise. I mean, I think there's a lot of praise that should be given to ancient Greece and the thinkers and the philosophers and the politicians for creating what they did, but it was not anywhere close to a utopia. You know, you look at like the French Revolution where they were dressing up in togas. You know, like we want to be, have a deity of reason that we're going to worship and all this other kind of nonsense because they thought it was just perfect. And Hegel's criticism of them is, well, you can't recreate that now because it's different. I agree with that, but they didn't even have that then, is my point. You know, I think it's to say that they had this unanimity of purpose and that they were all just based on reason. Certainly that's not the case when you see about them making decisions in their assembly to do crazy stuff and then reverse it almost immediately, as we talked about in different podcasts.
Moving on to the inadequacy of Greek institutions. There's something to envy, but the unity of the individual polis was fragile. He says Socrates was the death knell of Athens. He revealed that true autonomy is founded in our ability to govern ourselves by the light of reason. And this is the crux of Hegel's freedom. So it's not just that we have the freedom, to participate in the polis, but everybody is free if they have autonomy. He says Socrates also prefigured Christ, awaiting the Christian understanding of the world. He says Socrates showed philosophical inadequacy of the world spirit in Greek culture, while Alexander the Great showed the inadequacy of Greek political organization. So there's two parts to this. He says Alexander shows how history is propelled by individuals who are simultaneously important and unimportant. He says history needs great individuals to do its work and then tosses them aside as spent forces. He also says that history is everywhere and always the work of God. He says it is certainly a tale of sound and fury. It is, after all, a slaughter bench and a court before which cultures and nations appear and receive their death sentences, but is far from signifying nothing. It is also far from being a drama behind which there stands a personal deity, the author whose script we are ordained to act out. The idea of a drama that, so to speak, writes itself is not an easy one to grasp. He says that's sort of what history is. It's writing itself. He says the Christian conception of the value of the individual soul grounds inward freedom, and the legal rational state grounds outward freedoms. That's where we're kind of moving away from the ancient Greeks and sort of perfecting that. He says all will be free if we have these two systems, the value of the individual soul and a legal rational state. He says freedom is rational autonomy, not the arbitrary power of the despot, nor pure loyalty to the polis. So that is what he really ultimately defines freedom as, is this idea of rational autonomy. That's what he's looking at going forward. Any thoughts on that before we move into the philosophy of right?
Just briefly, his statement about certain people, and really we're talking about men, in his period and before, that make a big change or important historical figures, and then society just tosses them aside after they've fulfilled their function. I just couldn't help but think of Trump. I mean, he was a wrecking ball for 4 years, and I think he's just being tossed aside at this point. But
probably for the best.
Maybe he's got another term in him. I don't know, but I think there's a long history of that.
Yeah. Well, his point is Alexander the Great died.
That's not a good example because he died so young, and it wasn't that he was necessarily cast aside, although possibly because there was some dissension because he just kept on the move and kept kind of trying to conquer people. But so he may have been poisoned, or he may have just died of malaria of some other natural cause. But I don't see that as somebody that's been cast aside. It's not like somebody that was a leader that was in office and they got voted out of office and they died in obscurity, or the people that got banished, or some of the philosophers that got killed, Well,
he's not saying cast aside by society. He's saying cast aside by history and sort of like the world itself. He says, well, the world achieved its purpose. Alexander did what he needed to do, and then the mosquito sent from the world killed him and he was done. And that was all he was needed for.
I see what you're saying. Yeah, that's true. That's true, I guess. Yes. I mean, I don't believe it, but...
Yes, but I can see where he's coming from.
Because he believes in the
world spirit.
History is his world spirit.
Yes, exactly. But moving on to the philosophy of right, which is where the rest of this chapter comes from, and is more political stuff. It says, only a community with rationally acceptable systems of law and conventional morality has any claim to authority, and only rationally defensible ethical principles have any claim to form the bases of politics. So it's very much based on rationality and ethics and things like that. He says this community is the German world, but the German world is not what we think of today. He says this has often been misunderstood as defending German nationalism and claiming that only the Germans can create a free politics. He thought nothing of the sort. His immediate successors in Germany complained with much more reason that he was not a German nationalist at all. The German world is Europe east of the Elbe. It is Charlemagne's Europe, the Europe that was fed by the Latin Christian tradition, by memories of the glories of Rome, and by the wilder, less tamed individualism of the Germanic tribes that resisted Romanization. It had learned the importance of individual conscience and of social order, and even if its political organization was far from fully manifesting the principles that legitimated it, it was an instantiation, however imperfect, of concrete freedom and practical reason. So very much this idea of the West as we sort of think about it today.
That's his term for what we consider the West.
Yes, that's what I'm saying, yes.
Right.
He also disliked utilitarian structures because they were so based on the achievement of the happiness for the most people. But he says happiness is too vague, shifty, and indeterminate of a goal. He says the political science should build its politics on the will. He says the wills are the same for all rational beings, so therefore there is a general will. This is not the general will of Rousseau, but this general will grows out of social interactions and lives that people are taught to lead by education and socialization, and whose rationality they understand retrospectively. So it's kind of just something that happens naturally from a people. It's not really so much of a goal that we're trying to achieve, but just what these people do through their lives and through their socialization.
Yeah, I think we would view some of that as just our culture.
Yeah.
Like the whatever our culture is as a society generally.
True.
Yeah, I think using kind of more common terms.
Very true. The philosophy of right, he then says, is divided into 3 sections: abstract right, morality, and ethical life. It begins with the famous preface that states that the goal of philosophy is to achieve understanding and not offer advice. This is the introduction states that freedom must consist in autonomy, as there would be no system of rights without creatures who desire and need rules to control and license those desires. So this idea that we need autonomy, and that is fundamental to setting up any sort of rights.
And I like how he focuses on self-control as a form of autonomy.
Mm-hmm.
And people think that license is freedom.
Yes.
Or what do you call it? Lascivious? What's the term I'm thinking of? I always mispronounce it. Where you just do whatever you want that you think feels good.
Yeah.
And having no control over your appetites, that's not freedom. You have to have self-control and self-moderation in order to really be truly free. And it seems contradictory, but in practice, that's the only way. Because if you don't control yourself, then you're not free either.
Yeah, exactly. We begin with this idea of abstract right. He says he's very concerned with the nature of property rights, and that relationship between person and thing is characterized abstractly. He says, when we look at something and we perceive it as somebody else's, we're not, giving that thing value, or we're not stealing it because the thing itself is made of something, but because of the relationship to that other person. It is theirs just because it is theirs, and that is the end of it, essentially. But he says rights are grounded in some form of possession. He says we possess our physical selves in that we put our will into them to move them, but we don't fully own our bodies, as full ownership includes the rights to destroy, dispose, and trade things. We cannot destroy our bodies without destroying ourselves, so nobody else can own us either, just because we cannot own ourselves fully.
Yeah, I completely disagree with
you disagree?
Yeah, I think you can destroy yourself. I think you can sell yourself. I think you can transfer yourself to others. You can give yourself into slavery or prostitution or whatever. I don't agree with that. I think you can kill yourself. Now, if you have but his philosophy is that you're still part of the greater God being, I guess. And of course, Catholic philosophy would say your soul still exists. But when you're talking about ownership, I guess in a practical sense, you can destroy your body for political purposes, a political philosophy. You're no longer a participant in politics. Whether as a religious matter, I think it's different. But
sure. He says, kind of based on this, he says slavery is therefore absolutely wrong, although. Got to have the although when any of these people are talking about slavery. He says, although it had a place in a world where wrong was partial right, he says he spends some time talking about this, but doesn't really make much sense. Because
Well,
there's a period of
It
time.
makes a lot of sense. It's a situational ethics. So if you believe that history or the God being is the essence of what the world is, like the human history is what God is and is created and destroyed over time, then whatever was right at that time in that cultural values then is right then.
Sure.
It's just wrong now, and it's a historical moral relativism. Now, having said that, I understand. I don't condemn people who lived 400 years ago as slaves. I mean, other than philosophers have been talking about how bad slavery is since at least Aristotle, right? Or Socrates, I guess. Although maybe Socrates justified it. But I know Aristotle was critical of it, but said it was like a necessary evil. But he would say, some justification for it. But it certainly was debated for 2,000 years. So we're all on notice, so I wouldn't excuse them. But I understand that we're all of our time.
I wouldn't condemn them, but I would still say that slavery is absolutely wrong no matter when it is.
When it is, correct. And I may condemn them. I mean, it kind of depends. I mean, of course, we're not the absolute judge of everything.
I wish.
But I I wouldn't want that power. But anyway, so I understand what he's saying, and it makes sense for his philosophy. Because how can you say that a prior culture, how everybody decided what was right or wrong is wrong based upon our current morals?
True. That is true. He then goes on to say that free labor isn't slavery. He says we must be able to freely sell part of our time to an employer while remaining essentially free. But this sort of definition also places indentured servitude into slavery, because it's selling all of your time for freedom later and things like that, which is what he says is slavery. He says there's an absolute...
And it's a weird coming from this particular time, because you had child labor back then, and these people didn't work the hours we do. There was not a 40-hour work week back then. And for him to make a distinction between indentured servitude and working class slubs who are in a mine, I don't know. I don't see the difference. Yeah, and I don't see the difference from a lot of them with present day. Although you have a lot more free time, a lot more freedom, but when you're doing the grind and you have work 2 jobs to pay your bills, you feel like you're a servant. And then the whole COVID thing, I'm going to bring up COVID every episode.
Oh, good.
That, when you had the political, higher ups going out to dinner with no mask, and they had all their servants wearing masks, it really highlighted how we have a servant class in our culture currently. Yes. Anyway. Moving on.
Yes, he says there's an absolute right of the free will to put itself into any unoccupied thing. Says ownership lends things a human quality by infusing them with our own wills. Says our relationships with one another as persons matter, and the treatment of things is a facet of those relations. When we say somebody owns something, it's not just because they have it; it's because we respect the relationship between us. And then he goes on
this is the philosophy of finders keepers.
Pretty much. He goes into this theory of acquisition. He says there's 3 forms of possession. The first is consumption, which he says is the simplest and is even achieved by animals, to just take in something and eat it and use it. The second is working to obtain something. He says consumption annihilates nature while working transforms it. It takes things into the world of human activity, and the modern workers acquire money rather than partial ownership of the worked upon items. He says you can own something if you transform it, then it is fundamentally yours because you put in your time and your effort to make it yours.
Kind of like if you had a log and you carved something out of it.
Yes,
it's different than he's saying it's essentially the same thing as if you worked at a job and got paid.
Yeah,
you own the money. Your work now owns the money, which you can transfer to other people.
Yes, exactly. But he says there's a third, and that is just marking something as mine. So this is his sort of idea of contracts. You didn't physically work to achieve this, but it's very much founded on sort of the transferring of objects. And when you transfer the objects, they remain owned throughout the transfer. We remain entitled to the worth of our objects. We don't necessarily own the physical thing, forever, but we own the worth of it. So if I make a contract to give you my bike for $30, I always own the worth of that $30 if it's a bike or if it's money.
Yeah, I don't know why he's really making the distinction and really talking about this, because I mean it's so there's no reason why you can't transfer ownership. I don't know why his philosophy had to, because he's saying, well, you still own the worth of it, and so it's equating the same thing. I don't know. Why don't you just say, well, you own it until the moment of transfer, which is well, in modern day standard contract law.
Yeah.
You once you transfer ownership, once you sign the deed,
Mm-hmm.
boom, you don't own it anymore. You better get that money,
Yeah.
before you sign the deed.
Well, he's a philosopher,
Yeah.
so if he's basing everything on this idea of possession, he has to really make sure he has all his bases covered.
Well, yeah, but you just say at the you have ownership because you have a claim of right or a possession of it. You took it, you found it, or whatever.
Sure.
And you still have the same contract theory, but your ownership ends when you relinquish your claim.
Sure.
And that's really what you do. And the other person owns the money, and they own it until the moment they relinquish their claim, which is instantaneously at the same time. There's no time difference generally and legally.
Yes.
As part of a contract.
Yes.
It's
He seems to get really worked up about this like gray area when you're actually transferring the thing. But,
yeah, and he shouldn't.
Yeah.
There is no time if you have a contract. Now there may be, when you have an agreement, there may be conditions and there may be a break in time, but that's part of the contract itself. But
Sure.
if you just have, like, I'm going to sell the bike, here's $10 to $20 for the bike. Well, at that exchange, it's immediate.
That makes sense. We then move on to morality. He says, ownership and rights leads to morality. He says, if I steal what is yours, I have committed a wrong and will feel guilt if I have a conscience. And so if we have a conscience, that leads into a system of morality. But here, Hegel attacks Kant's conception of morality based on non-contrasting rational maxims. He says, we cannot hold ourselves to the standards that Kant claims. He says, it cannot generate an ethical system without an appeal to consequences. That's another big flaw with Kant's system. He says, Hegel also implies that this conception was responsible for the reign of terror. He says here, the problem was the combination of an extreme moral individualism with an equally extreme rationalism. Figures such as Robespierre believed themselves morally infallible, and therefore believed their opponents to be either mad or evil or both. Finally, Kant's insistence that the individual's reason is the final court of judgment before which institutions, actions, and even the dictates of God himself are to be tried was anathema to Hegel. So
Anathema?
I always say anathema.
Oh.
I don't know. But this idea that, we're all essentially, the arbiters of our own morality. It's our own non-contrasting maxims within ourselves. That's why it's too individual. It's also weird, intellectual, and it gives rise to all of these problems. So
I tend to agree with that, but I don't think his philosophy is any better,
Yeah.
which is really the morality of the culture,
Yeah.
really, isn't it? I mean,
more or less, yes. But then we move into the ethical life. He says he sets up three parts of the rational modern political community: the family, civil society, and the state. He says that the family is not the anthropological or historical idea, but the modern nuclear family, constituted and protected by legal arrangements. He says civil society is permeated by politics and structured by laws and managed by a well-ordered administrative state, and the state is the rational modern state, and one state among others. So to get into his idea of family here, he says it is the realm of unselfish attachment to particular other people based on the love of two adults and devoted to bringing up children. He also says it's very subjective. We fall in love with particular people and don't need to justify this. He says marriage is not just a contract, it's this idea of love between two people.
Love is love.
Love is love. The family, he says, isn't self-sufficient. The point of the family is to launch children into the world as adults, and a given family is intended not to endure. So this idea that it's sort of transitory. It's very
Eventually you die, I guess.
Yeah, eventually you die. It's very subjective, but it's the very smallest part of society and the ethical life. But then we move into the civil society, which is the realm of contractual relationships. It is non-intimate and is built on the individual's self-interest. It is the world of work and exchange. It says the individual promotes the general interest in promoting his own, and his motivation is economic benefit. He then sets up another trio. He really, really likes his trios in this section.
He likes the Trinity.
The Trinity, yes. He sets up a trio of social classes that are the hinge between civil society and the state proper. And so this is, he uses different terms for them at different points, but landlords, capitalists, and laborers. Laborers, of course, work on the land, and capitalists work in the non-landed economies. These are things like doctors and lawyers and things like that don't actually produce something physical necessarily. These are the two productive classes, and above these two stands the universal class of landlords. These are the administrators and the officials who are the promoters of the general good and the common interest of society. So you have these two productive ones and these two essentially this one bureaucratic class essentially pursuing the common good. There's also an underclass of the unemployed and unemployable, who he says form a rabble of paupers, which is a great band name.
There you go.
Rabble of Paupers. Yes, fantastic. So those are his different, social classes outside of this family.
Gotta start writing these band names.
We should.
What was the last one? It was
Deranged Intellectuals. That's the one you really like.
Yes. Rabble of Paupers.
Rabble of Paupers. Yes.
It's kind of funny how he recognizes that as a problem.
Yeah.
That there's always going to be some group in society, modern society,
who are not really
unemployable or
producing anything,
will not be employed.
True. He's also
that's a hard nut to crack, but we can talk about that some other time.
Yes. He also placed a lot of emphasis on corporations, which really he means are sort of like guilds, the companies that you would work for nowadays. He says they integrate individuals into the economic life by giving them a career and allegiance to colleagues. That's how you transfer from the family into this economic world through these corporations or guilds or companies, whatever term you want to give them. But he also believed that 19th century capitalism produced too many unwanted side effects. He says the unpredictability of agricultural markets could cause sudden poverty and famine, and the booms and slumps threatened livelihoods and political stability. So he says the government needs an economic regulatory role and a certain welfare system to keep things functioning.
Yeah, and it really was so crazy back then, 1700, 1800s, where you had these wild variances, changes in the value of commodities, of your corn, your hogs, your cow, everything, and you could 1 year you could be wealthy, raising the same amount of crops, and the next year you couldn't sell them. They're completely valueless, and people would starve. It was. So that unregulated capitalism is pretty awful too.
Yeah. Well, he makes an interesting point in here too. He says, this is still the time of widespread famines, and then that disappeared for a while, and then was brought back really in full force by good old Stalin, is what he says here with the mismanagement of the Soviet Union, which is interesting.
And I don't think. Part of it was mismanagement. Part of it was just forced starvation of his opponents. It's like accidentally on purpose. Whoops! I killed 8 million people. I didn't like any of them. So it's a happy coincidence, I guess.
The acts of the socialist god, I guess.
Yeah. Well, Mao did the same thing in China. Crazy. Yeah.
But now we move into his discussion of the state, the last section of this chapter, and the very, very political one. I feel like this is really where we get into his actual political theory.
Yeah, I should have done this one first.
He says the rational state must allow for the representation of interests, and the will of the people must be both respected and despised. He says the ordinary people know whether affairs are handled well or poorly, but cannot spontaneously make policy like the well-informed representatives.
Right.
So good distinction there. He says genuine self-government has limits, and therefore representation is very important. So he's very, very big on representation. And so he begins his discussion on the state with the Constitution. He says the modern state must be a constitutional monarchy. And this monarchical element is a dictate of logic, not necessarily a specific king or queen, but there must be a final moment when a law becomes a law. So a queen or a president must sign a bill making it law. So he says, the United States, the republic under the president, would be a constitutional monarchy, really, according to Hegel.
Little did he know the Supreme Court would usurp that authority. Now they are the monarchy. Fancy robes and...
Interesting. We've talked about that several times. He says, although a state may need the support of religion, this is some interesting thoughts here, there must be separation. He says, no church should exercise coercive power, and no state should inspect the religious beliefs of its people. But, however, the Jewish practice makes Jews only dubious members of modern civil society. Right. There's always something about the Jews with every one of these people. Always some exception for how the Jews are not the right religious people. But he also divided the powers into legislative, judicial, and executive.
They just couldn't get around the fact that the Jews just wanted to be a little separate. They wanted to have their own little community. And it makes sense that they did, because all these Jew haters are out there. It's like
we have to hide from Hegel.
It's like a self-fulfilling problem.
Well, that's really what it was. Yeah. Because I might have talked about this before, but they were essentially the scapegoats for every disaster. Because the Jews would live on their own.
Correct.
And then when economic famine, whatever, disease inflicts the main population, the Jews would be fine.
Right.
It's like, well, the Jews are fine. We're all dying. Yes. They made this happen.
That's right.
Let's isolate them even more. And so next time it happens, they just blame the Jews even harder.
That's right.
So.
That's right. It happens so often, even today, where people are blaming the Jews for stuff, and I'm like, oh, it's the Jews. It's like, oh gosh, you're so they're so lazy intellectually to blame the small population for.
Are
any
you telling
problems.
me Kanye is lazy intellectually?
I'm
That is
not,
a surprise.
I'm not commenting on Kanye. I didn't say I think it's sad, and I think he's mentally ill,
Yes.
and I think people have been taking advantage of him for many, many years, and I hope he gets help because he's clearly, and since you kind of introduced that subject, I've represented mentally ill people that are mentally disturbed, and not all, very few of them are obviously mentally ill. And I'm talking about the people that are truly delusional.
Yeah.
Some of them are. They can't even function. They don't really have any concept of reality. But most have a concept of reality. But you get talking to them, their brains clearly don't work the same way as other people, and they have a lot of conspiracy theories. They have a lot of irrational thoughts and delusions, and sometimes, of course, hallucinations. But you can talk to them and have a conversation, and then all of a sudden the conversation just goes sideways. I mean, within 5 minutes, it's pretty quick. But I mean, I'm no psychologist and no expert in the field, but it seems to me when I was watching some of his interviews, clearly the guy needs help.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And to just keep broadcasting what he's saying, and I think Twitter did him a favor by shutting off his account, let him try to get a moment. But maybe I'm being more kind to him than he deserves, but I think he's just mentally ill, and I think people have been profiting off of him and his talent and his sales by just kind of keeping it under wraps.
Yeah, I agree.
Sad.
I agree.
But that that he's different. I think he's a different situation than the vast majority of people that just hate the Jews and want to scapegoat him.
Yeah.
It's like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
But
Very true.
It's a very virulent, strong
Yes.
strain in political thought.
Yeah.
Going back obviously before Hegel.
Yeah, this is not the first time we've encountered this.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
It is. But yeah, I was saying he divided the powers into legislative, judicial, and executive. He says the members of landed nobility have a legislative house of their own, and the administrators, that sort of overarching class that I just described, sits in parliament. He also very heavily condemned democracy, very in favor of representative systems, not just direct democracy. He was also hostile to social contract theories. This is interesting, his thoughts on war.
Right.
He says, the essence of the state is that it can exact unconditional obedience. It has our lives in its hands because it is entitled to send us to war. He says, the state is most visibly itself in the international sphere. And I'm struggling to read my handwriting. The ultimate test, I think that's an alternate. That doesn't make any sense. The ultimate test of being is war. It says war preserves the ethical health of nations, and lasting peace could produce stagnation. So he emphasized the normality of war as a method of resolving disputes between states. He says war is not wholly lawless. It employs force in a measured fashion to secure national objectives.
Right. And it's he was obviously was enamored by Napoleon of that time,
of course.
And there were so many people that lost their lives in the various Napoleonic wars. I just don't understand why anybody would think he was a good guy or a great guy, and why anybody would think that war is just public policy by other means after having experienced it in their lifetimes. I mean, there was a battle in his hometown. You'd think that the carnage would dissuade you of having that philosophy, but I guess it didn't.
Yeah, well, I guess this is also kind of the period of like the really like regimented battles. Everybody line up, you shoot those guys, and then we stand here while they shoot us, and that sort of thing.
Well,
so
it's that culture of chivalry was still there. Like you, as a matter of honor, you would be in the infantry or whatever, maybe play your part. But it just seems insane to me.
Yeah, it does. But I could see what he means as like sort of the practical side of resolving disputes. But then again, it's like, well, that's disputes with people's lives who are not the leaders of those countries.
Yeah, it's just like George Costanza's dad would say, there's got to be a better way.
Oh, that's Festivus, of course. I guess I should have mentioned this is our first episode of 2023.
Oh, that's right. Happy New Year.
Yes, Happy New Year to all of our listeners.
We did celebrate Festivus again.
We did celebrate Festivus.
On December 23rd.
Yes, of course we did.
The ceremonial watching of the Seinfeld episode.
Yes, highly recommend if you haven't seen it.
We had our silver pole out.
We did.
We didn't really do
the feats of strength
or the feats of strength.
I look at this like your airing of grievances, this podcast. I think we get that out of the way throughout the rest of the year.
Yeah, that's true.
He then goes on to say that organized political societies are actors in world history. He says without the modern states, the universality of freedom would have no space in which to express itself. So it's important that we have the state at all in order to express our freedom. He says states are valued in Hegelian schema as an instrument for a larger historical process and then discarded once the state serves its purposes. And then he goes on to talk about how Hegel was both liberal and conservative, and I'll kind of conclude with that here because I thought it was interesting. He says, it is right to acknowledge the liberal strain in Hegel. He was glad to see the end of the feudal order in Germany, argued for occupational freedom, disapproved of the existence of an established church. The conservative strain exists too. He was no friend to democracy. The conviction that the truth is to be found in the whole gives the status quo the benefit of the doubt, and a man as friendly as he was to the substantial or agrarian way of life could not be a wholehearted modernizer. Like St. Simon, he put his trust in rational administration and downplayed the role of politics in the everyday rough and tumble sense. The tension is greater in Hegel because he wants to emphasize the freedom of modern man, not only his need for order. So very fascinating figure, covered a lot of different topics, but overall kind of, bounces back and forth on some issues. But I do kind of like a lot of what he says. I think it's, once we get down to the actual politics of it, it's really just based on, rationality and common sense at this point, I feel.
Yeah, he really has kind of this vague notion of God and religion and morality based on a common culture, which strikes me as weird.
Yeah.
But his general philosophy of governance, a lot of it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I do. I do. I do find some value in his sort of, idea of history a little bit, because I think it is important to acknowledge, that there are some figures that are just more important, that have, contributed more than others, and following that sort of thing. If we're looking at human progress as an overall story, you have to look at those certain things over others.
Yeah, and it's just being honest that most people don't make a difference.
that is true. That is sad, but it is true.
But I mean, if you're really talking about political philosophy, it's what is it they say? Something to the bold. I don't know. What was it?
That was a good quote right there.
Victory goes to the bold, or something along those lines.
Yes.
I'm completely losing my train of thought. To the victor, no.
To the victor goes the spoils. I know that one.
There's that one. Oh, something about being bold.
Courage favors the bold. Fortune favors the bold.
Fortune favors the bold.
There we go.
Yeah,
got there in the end.
And so if you, I think he would subscribe to that. You gotta get in there and get in the mix, and because not everybody's gonna make a difference.
That is true.
So you gotta get out there and do it.
That is true. Any closing thoughts?
No.
All right. This has been Unlimited Opinions, Season 4, Episode 19. You could still win a T-shirt. Competition's still ongoing until somebody leaves a review.
Look at the reviews. Have you looked at reviews?
I have looked at reviews recently.
Oh, no reviews?
No reviews.
I'll have to get a...
Well, we have reviews, but none within the time frame that we've been looking for
right.
reviews.
Well, maybe our favorite listener will actually put a review on.
Maybe. She still can.
Oh, it's a she.
Well, I figured that's who we were talking about. You might have a different favorite listener, but yeah. All right. Well, I've been Adam Bishop.
I'm still Mark.
And this has been Unlimited Opinions.
Good night. I got tired.
I can tell you're getting tired over there.